The Mediterranean Sea, summer of 1943. A lone Italian submarine cuts through the dark waters, its crew confident in the protection their steel hull provides beneath the waves. Above, a British patrol aircraft circles methodically, waiting. The submarine commander orders a crash dive, believing the deep blue sanctuary will shield them from aerial attack, as it always has. But this time, something follows them down into the depths. Something silent, something deadly, something the Italians never saw coming. The torpedo tracks the submarine's own propeller noise, homing in with mechanical precision. Within minutes, the ocean swallows another boat and its crew, victims of a weapon so secret that even Allied pilots called it by a code name to hide its true nature. This is the story of the acoustic torpedo that revolutionized submarine warfare and left the Italian submarine fleet utterly helpless in the final years of the Mediterranean campaign. If you want to discover more untold stories from World War II that changed the course of history, hit that subscribe button now and join us as we dive deep into the secrets that shaped the war at sea. The Royal Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, entered the Second World War with high ambitions and a respectable submarine fleet. In June 1940, Italy possessed over 100 submarines, a force that Mussolini's propaganda machine touted as a decisive weapon in the coming struggle for Mediterranean dominance. The Italian submarine service had experienced officers, many trained in realistic conditions, and boats designed for operations in both the confined waters of the Mediterranean and the vast expanses of the Atlantic. In theory, these submarines should have strangled Allied shipping lanes, cut Britain's lifeline to Egypt and the Suez Canal, and turned the Mare Nostrum into an Axis lake. Reality proved far more complicated. Italian submarines scored notable successes early in the conflict. They sank merchant vessels, damaged warships, and forced the Royal Navy to divert precious escort resources to protect convoys threading through the Mediterranean narrows. But by 1941, the tide had begun to turn against them. Allied anti-submarine warfare capabilities evolved rapidly, transforming the hunter into the hunted. British and later American forces deployed an increasingly sophisticated network of detection and destruction systems that made submarine operations progressively more dangerous. The Italians found themselves facing enemies who could see them, hear them, and kill them with alarming efficiency. Radar became the first game changer. Early warning systems allowed Allied ships and aircraft to detect surfaced submarines at ranges the Italians had never anticipated. A submarine on the surface to recharge batteries or transit at higher speeds became vulnerable to sudden attack from beyond visual range. Commanders who had grown accustomed to the relative safety of surface operations now faced a deadly dilemma. Stay surfaced for speed and endurance, but risk detection and destruction, or remain submerged with limited battery life and glacially slow speeds that made intercepting targets nearly impossible. Underwater, the situation grew equally grim. ASDIC, known to the Americans as sonar, gave Allied escort vessels the ability to detect and track submerged submarines through active acoustic pulses. A destroyer equipped with ASDIC could methodically hunt a diving submarine, following its every turn and depth change, positioning itself perfectly to deliver a lethal barrage of depth charges. Italian submariners learned to dread the distinctive ping of sonar sweeping through the hull, knowing that detection meant a desperate game of cat and mouse in 3 dimensions, with death raining down from above in the form of drum-shaped explosives calibrated to detonate at specific depths. High-frequency direction finding, known as HFDF or HFDUF to Allied crews, added another layer to the Allied advantage. Italian submarines, like all submarines of the era, relied on radio communications to receive orders, report contact with enemy ships, and coordinate operations. Every transmission became a potential death sentence. Allied direction-finding stations could triangulate a submarine's position from its radio signals, vectoring ships and aircraft toward the transmitting boat. Italian commanders found themselves caught between the operational necessity of communication and the lethal consequences of breaking radio silence. Air cover completed the encirclement. Allied patrol aircraft, primarily flying from bases in Malta, North Africa, Gibraltar and later Sicily and southern Italy after the invasion, maintained relentless surveillance over key transit routes and operational areas. Sunderland flying boats, Wellington bombers converted for maritime patrol, American liberators with their exceptional range, and Catalina amphibians crisscrossed the Mediterranean around the clock. When these aircraft spotted a submarine on the surface, they attacked immediately with bombs and depth charges. Even if the submarine managed to crash dive before the aircraft arrived overhead, it faced hours submerged, batteries draining, air growing foul, waiting for the patrol plane to exhaust its fuel and depart. The psychological strain on Italian submarine crews became as debilitating as the physical danger. By 1942, Italian submarine losses had climbed to unsustainable levels. Experienced crews disappeared into the depths with increasing frequency. Replacement crews lacked the seasoning and intuition of their predecessors, making them even more vulnerable to Allied tactics. The Regia Marina struggled to maintain operational boats as losses mounted faster than shipyards could replace them. Morale within the submarine service declined sharply. Submariners are a special breed, volunteers who accept extraordinary risks for the chance to strike decisive blows against an enemy's maritime lifelines. But there is a difference between accepting calculated risks and sailing into near certain death. Italian submariners increasingly faced the latter. The Italian boats themselves contributed to their vulnerability. Many were designed for surface operations in the Mediterranean's relatively calm conditions, with large conning towers and deck guns that created significant radar signatures and made rapid diving difficult. Their diesel engines produced distinctive acoustic signatures that Allied sonar operators learned to recognize. Diving times were slower than German U-boats, giving Allied aircraft precious extra seconds to position for attack. Once submerged, Italian submarines had respectable but not exceptional depth capabilities, limiting their ability to evade persistent prosecution by surface escorts. These design characteristics, adequate in the war's opening phase, became fatal flaws as Allied anti-submarine warfare reached maturity. Into this increasingly one-sided struggle came a weapon so revolutionary and so secret that it would render Italian submarines even more helpless than they already were. The weapon's very existence remained unknown to Axis forces until after the war ended. Allied crews who employed it spoke of it only in cryptic terms, using code names designed to mislead enemy intelligence. That weapon was the Mark 24 acoustic torpedo, christened Fido by the Americans who perfected it, a name chosen to evoke a faithful dog following its master, rather than a revolutionary manhunting machine. The story of Fido begins not in a naval shipyard or a military research facility, but in the academic halls of Harvard University. In the early years of the war, the United States Navy recognized that defeating the submarine menace required more than just better detection systems. Detection was merely the first step. Once detected, submarines had to be destroyed, and the existing weapons for submarine destruction left much to be desired. Depth charges required aircraft or ships to position themselves almost directly over a submerged submarine and rely on blast effect to crush the hull or damage vital systems. This demanded precise positioning, perfect timing, and a degree of luck. Even a slight error in estimating the submarine's depth or speed could result in a miss, and a miss meant the submarine survived to escape or fight another day. What the Navy needed was a weapon that could chase down a submarine after it dived, following it through evasive maneuvers, ignoring decoys, and detonating close enough to guarantee a kill. The Navy needed a smart weapon, a torpedo with a brain, or at least a torpedo with ears. The Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory received the contract to develop exactly that, working in close partnership with British researchers who had been pursuing similar concepts, and with engineers from General Electric and other contractors. The Harvard team began developing an acoustic homing torpedo optimized for anti-submarine warfare. The physics underlying acoustic homing are elegant in their simplicity. Every submarine underway produces noise. Propellers churning through water create a distinctive acoustic signature, a complex mix of frequencies dominated by the blade rate and cavitation effects. Diesel engines, electric motors, reduction gears, and auxiliary machinery all contribute to the cacophony. Even a submarine attempting to run silent produces detectable noise, and a submarine actively evading, running at higher speeds with all systems operational, becomes a veritable underwater brass band. An acoustic torpedo needed only to listen for that noise, determine its direction, and steer toward the source. Building such a torpedo presented formidable engineering challenges. The acoustic sensors had to be sensitive enough to detect submarine noise at useful ranges, but not so sensitive that they picked up the torpedo's own machinery or confused waves, marine life, and other extraneous sounds for the target. The guidance system had to process acoustic information in real time and translate it into steering commands, all within the constraints of 1940s vacuum tube electronics, mechanical gyroscopes, and hydraulic actuators. The weapon had to be small enough and light enough for aircraft to carry externally, yet large enough to contain the necessary sensors, guidance systems, propulsion, and warhead. And it all had to work reliably in the harsh environment of saltwater, pressure, temperature variations, and violent motion. The Harvard team and their partners succeeded brilliantly. The Mk-24 torpedo that emerged from their efforts measured just over 7 feet long and 19 inches in diameter, weighing around 680 pounds. That made it significantly smaller and lighter than conventional anti-ship torpedoes, a crucial factor for aerial delivery. The weapon carried a 92-pound warhead, more than sufficient to crack open a submarine hull, especially if it detonated close alongside or underneath the target. Unlike conventional torpedoes designed for high-speed attacks on surface ships, Fido ran slow, around 12 knots, to minimize its own noise signature and extend its battery life. At that speed, it could search for up to 15 minutes, covering a significant volume of ocean in its hunt. The acoustic homing system represented the heart of Fido's lethality. Sensitive hydrophones mounted in the nose listened for the target's acoustic signature across a range of frequencies. When the sensors detected noise consistent with a submarine, the guidance system compared the signal strength from different hydrophones to determine the target's bearing. If the target lay to port, the torpedo turned left. If it lay to starboard, the torpedo turned right. If the signal strength increased, the torpedo continued on its current heading. If the signal weakened, the torpedo executed a search pattern, spiraling outward to reacquire the contact. This constant process of listen, analyze, and steer continued until either the torpedo found its target or exhausted its battery. From a submarine's perspective, Fido was nearly undetectable and entirely unstoppable once launched. Conventional torpedoes produced distinctive sounds that sonar operators could hear, giving the target at least a chance to maneuver defensively. Fido's slow speed and careful acoustic design made it much quieter than conventional torpedoes, and its small size made it difficult to detect even if a submarine's sonar happened to be active. More insidiously, the very actions a submarine took to evade other threats made it more vulnerable to Fido. Increasing speed to escape a depth charge attack meant noisier propellers and louder machinery, giving Fido a stronger signal to follow. Changing depth or turning hard produced transient noises that attracted the torpedo like blood in the water attracts sharks. The submarine's own defensive maneuvers became a dinner bell summoning its destruction. The secrecy surrounding Fido matched its technological sophistication. The Allies understood that once the Germans and Italians learned about acoustic homing torpedoes, they would develop countermeasures. They might design quieter submarines, develop noisemakers to decoy the weapons, or change their tactics to minimize vulnerability. Any of these responses would reduce Fido's effectiveness and cost Allied lives. Maintaining absolute secrecy about the weapon's existence and nature became a strategic imperative, second only to the Manhattan Project's veil of silence. To preserve secrecy, the Allies implemented elaborate deception measures. Fido was never called a torpedo in official communications. Instead, it was designated a mine, specifically the Mark 24 mine. This nomenclature appeared in all documents, operations orders, after-action reports, and even in conversations among cleared personnel. Pilots who carried Fido into combat received briefings that emphasized the weapon's supposed role as an aerial mine, deployed in submarine operating areas, not as an active homing device. If an aircrew went down over enemy territory, or at sea where they might be captured, they could truthfully state under interrogation that they were dropping mines, not describing a revolutionary weapon the Axis navies had never imagined. Security extended to operational employment. Fido attacks occurred primarily at night or in poor visibility conditions when surviving Axis witnesses would be unlikely. After-action reports deliberately obscured details, attributing kills to depth charges or conventional bombs, even when Fido had made the kill. Allied intelligence services monitored Axis communications for any indication that the Germans or Italians had discovered the acoustic torpedo secret. None appeared. Even when U-boats and Italian submarines began disappearing under mysterious circumstances, Axis naval intelligence attributed the losses to improved detection methods, better placed depth charges, or simple bad luck. They never suspected that a weapon was hunting their submarines through the ocean's depths, guided by the submarine's own noise. The first Fidos entered service in mid-1943, just as the Allies prepared to invade Sicily and knock Italy out of the war. Timing could not have been better from the Allied perspective, or worse from the Italian. The Regia Marina's submarine force, already battered by conventional anti-submarine warfare, now faced an enemy they could neither detect nor defeat. The submarines operating in the Tyrrhenian Sea, the waters between Italy's west coast and Sardinia and Corsica, became particularly vulnerable. These relatively confined waters saw heavy submarine traffic as Italian boats attempted to interdict Allied shipping, supporting the invasion of Sicily and later the Italian mainland. Allied patrol aircraft saturated the area, and many carried the new acoustic torpedo. Consider what happened when an Allied patrol aircraft equipped with Fido detected an Italian submarine transiting on the surface. The encounter began conventionally enough. The aircraft's radar picked up the submarine from miles away, giving the pilot time to maneuver into an attack position while remaining outside visual range. The submarine, if it had lookouts alert and lucky, might spot the aircraft's approach and sound the crash dive alarm. Klaxons blaring, the crew scrambled to battle stations. The main ballast tank vents opened with a roar of compressed air. Water flooded into the ballast tanks, and the submarine's bow tilted downward as it dove for the safety of depth. In earlier battles, the crash dive often spelled survival. The aircraft would roar overhead, perhaps dropping a stick of depth charges or bombs that detonated close enough to shake the hull and terrify the crew, but not close enough to inflict fatal damage. Then the aircraft would climb away, circling overhead or heading off to search for other targets, and the submarine would eventually level off at a safe depth, electric motors humming, crew catching their breath, knowing they had cheated death again. But with Fido, the script changed fatally. The patrol aircraft, perhaps a B-24 Liberator adapted for maritime patrol or a British Wellington or Sunderland, approached the dive point. At the optimal moment, calculated based on the submarine's estimated depth and position, the bombardier or pilot triggered the release mechanism. Fido dropped away from its external rack, entered the water nose first with a splash that sent up a plume of spray, and immediately armed itself. The torpedo's propeller began turning, driving it downward at a shallow angle. Within seconds, the acoustic sensors activated, listening for the target. Inside the submarine, now at periscope depth or deeper and still diving, the crew believed they had escaped. The captain ordered the boat leveled off, perhaps at 100 or 150 feet, deep enough to be safe from most depth charges. The helmsman and diving officer worked to trim the boat, adjusting ballast and planes to maintain the ordered depth. In the control room, men wiped sweat from their faces and exchanged looks that mixed relief with lingering fear. The sound of the aircraft's engines had faded. No explosions had followed them down. They had survived another encounter. Then the torpedo found them. Fido's hydrophones picked up the submarine's propeller noise, the whine of electric motors, the sounds of pumps and machinery. The guidance system locked on and the torpedo began its final approach. Inside the submarine, if anyone was listening carefully on the hydrophones, they might have heard something approaching, a faint whirring noise growing steadily louder. But Fido was quiet, and the submarine's own noise masked it until far too late. The torpedo closed the final yards, its acoustic sensors guiding it to a point close alongside the hull or directly underneath where the explosion would do maximum damage. The warhead detonated with a force that turned water into a hammer. 92 pounds of high explosive created a bubble of superheated gas that expanded violently, then collapsed, creating a pressure wave that propagated through the submarine's hull. If the torpedo detonated underneath the boat, the pressure wave lifted the entire submarine upward, stressing the hull beyond its design limits. Seams split, welds cracked, and water poured in through breaches torn in the pressure hull. If the detonation occurred alongside, the blast effect was more concentrated but no less lethal, punching through the hull or crushing internal frames and machinery. Inside the submarine, the crew experienced a moment of total disorientation. The blast wave knocked men off their feet, shattered gauge glasses, and caused electrical systems to short out in sprays of sparks. Emergency lighting flickered on, revealing chaos. Water sprayed from ruptured pipes and torn hull plates. The boat might have lost depth control, either plummeting toward the seabed or rising uncontrollably toward the surface. In either case, time was measured in seconds. If the boat went down, increasing water pressure would complete what the torpedo began. collapsing the hull like a beer can crushed in a fist. If the boat surfaced uncontrollably, it emerged directly beneath circling Allied aircraft, ready to finish it with bombs, machine gun fire, or another Fido. Most Italian submarines hit by Fido never surfaced again. They sank with all hands, sometimes leaving nothing but an oil slick and debris field to mark where they died. A few, damaged but not immediately sunk, managed to surface, only to be annihilated by follow-up attacks from the aircraft that had launched the acoustic torpedo. Survivors, if there were any, found themselves in the water, clinging to wreckage, waiting for rescue that might never come, or might come in the form of capture. The Mediterranean's warm waters offered no comfort to men who had just watched their boat and their shipmates disappear into the depths. From the Allied aircrew's perspective, Fido attacks produced an eerie satisfaction mixed with professional detachment. A pilot who had spent hours droning over empty ocean, eyes straining for the telltale feather of a periscope wake or the silhouette of a surfaced submarine, finally achieved contact. The attack run proceeded according to training and doctrine. Weapons release at the optimal point, then waiting, circling overhead, watching the surface for confirmation. Sometimes the sea would suddenly erupt with a fountain of water and air, marking the torpedo's detonation and the submarine's death. Sometimes an oil slick would appear and spread across the surface, the submarine's lifeblood seeping from its corpse. Other times, wreckage would bob to the surface, debris and personal effects that told their own story of destruction. The aircrew would report the kill, mark the position, and either continue the patrol or head home. One more enemy submarine erased from the order of battle. The statistical record of Fido employment, while incomplete due to wartime secrecy, suggests extraordinary effectiveness. Globally, acoustic torpedoes sank dozens of Axis submarines, with kill rates far exceeding conventional aerial depth charges. In the Mediterranean specifically, Fido contributed significantly to the final collapse of Italian submarine operations. While precise attribution of individual sinkings remains difficult, several losses of Italian submarines between mid-1943 and the Italian armistice in September that year align with Fido deployment patterns and operational areas. These submarines simply disappeared, often in circumstances where conventional attacks should not have been successful, a pattern consistent with acoustic torpedo employment. The psychological impact on Italian submarine crews who survived encounters or heard rumors of mysterious submarine losses proved as significant as the actual sinkings. Submariners live with fear as a constant companion, but it is typically a fear grounded in understanding. They know the dangers of depth charges, bombs, ramming attacks, and collisions. They train to recognize and counter these threats, and that training provides a measure of control and comfort. But Fido introduced an unknown threat, a weapon that behaved in ways that defied the known rules of submarine warfare. Survivors reported strange experiences, hearing noises that followed the submarine through turns, feeling inexplicable explosions that seemed to track their movements. Intelligence officers and commanders dismissed many of these reports as combat stress or misidentification of conventional attacks, but the reports kept coming, building a mythology of ghost weapons that hunted submarines through the depths. This psychological dimension deserves emphasis. By late 1943, Italian submarine crews knew they faced almost certain death. The operational tempo had become a death spiral. Fewer boats meant each remaining boat had to conduct more patrols to maintain any semblance of operational effectiveness. More patrols meant more exposure to Allied anti-submarine forces. More exposure meant more losses. The cycle fed itself until the entire service teetered on the edge of collapse. Into this environment came whispers of a new weapon, a torpedo that chased submarines underwater, guided by invisible means to strike without warning. Whether the crews understood the specific mechanism of acoustic homing mattered less than the effect on morale. They were being hunted by something they could not see, hear, or escape, and that knowledge corroded whatever fighting spirit remained. The Italian armistice in September 1943 effectively ended the Regia Marina's submarine operations against the Allies. Most surviving boats either surrendered to Allied forces or were scuttled by their crews to prevent capture by the Germans. A handful escaped to German-controlled ports and were incorporated into the Kriegsmarine, serving under German command with mixed German and Italian crews. For these boats, and for the U-boat force that continued fighting until May 1945, the threat from acoustic torpedoes only intensified as production ramped up and employment became routine rather than experimental. Italian submarines were not the only victims of Fido, but they represented a particularly vulnerable target set. Their operational patterns in the confined Mediterranean, their acoustic signatures, and the timing of Fido introduction all conspired to make them ideal targets for the new weapon. Had the Italian submarine force remained effective through 1944 and 1945, Fido would have devastated it even more thoroughly than conventional anti-submarine warfare already had. The acoustic torpedo was not merely another weapon in the Allied arsenal. It represented a fundamental shift in the balance of submarine warfare, a shift that rendered obsolete virtually every tactical doctrine submarine forces had developed since the First World War. Of course, the Italians were not alone in facing acoustic homing torpedoes. The Germans, with their larger and more capable U-boat force, suffered heavily from Fido and from their own acoustic torpedo, the G7E's T5 Zaunkönig, which could be turned against them. The Germans eventually developed countermeasures, most notably the Foxer noisemaker, a device towed behind ships and submarines to produce loud noise that would attract acoustic torpedoes away from the actual target. The Foxer worked to some extent, causing Fido attacks to fail more often than early in the weapon's deployment, but it came too late to save most U-boats from the intensive Allied anti-submarine campaign of 1943 and 1944. For Italian submarines, countermeasures came too late to matter at all. The armistice arrived before any systematic defensive measures could be developed or deployed. Had Italy remained in the war longer, Italian engineers might have created their own versions of Foxer or developed tactics to minimize acoustic signature. Submarines might have learned to shut down all non-essential machinery when under attack, stop their screws completely, and drift silently in hopes that the acoustic torpedo would lose contact and exhaust its battery. These tactics did offer some defense against Fido in later stages of the war, but they required the submarine to become a sitting target, unable to maneuver or escape, hoping the hunters would give up before running out of air or battery power. The fundamental problem was that acoustic homing created a paradox with no satisfactory solution. A submarine's purpose is to move through the ocean, locate targets, and attack them. All of these activities require machinery that produces noise. Even a submarine drifting silently must eventually move again or suffocate. The moment it restarted its motors or engaged its screws, it became vulnerable to acoustic attack. Shutting down completely was not a survival strategy, but merely a way to delay the inevitable. A truly effective countermeasure would require either making submarines silent, beyond even acoustic homing torpedo sensors, or creating active defenses that could destroy or decoy incoming torpedoes. Neither option was technologically feasible in 1943. The legacy of the acoustic torpedo extends far beyond World War II. Every modern torpedo designed for anti-submarine warfare incorporates acoustic homing in some form, usually in combination with active sonar, wire guidance, and sophisticated signal processing to distinguish targets from decoys and background noise. The technology that began as Fido evolved through successive generations into today's weapons that can home on submarines running silent at extreme depths, distinguish one submarine class from another by acoustic signature analysis, and defeat multiple layers of countermeasures. The Italian submariners of 1943 who fell victim to Fido were not just casualties of a particular battle or campaign. They were the first victims of a revolution in naval warfare that continues to shape submarine design and tactics today. Think about the broader implications for a moment. Submarines were supposed to be invisible, protected by the ocean's vastness and depth. They represented a counter to surface naval superiority, a way for smaller powers to challenge larger navies through stealth and surprise. Acoustic homing torpedoes shattered that calculus. They turned the submarine's own characteristics against it, transforming noise from an operational hazard into a death sentence. This forced submarine design down a path of ever greater silencing, leading to today's nuclear submarines with pump-jet propulsion, anechoic tiles and machinery mounted on rafts to isolate vibration. It forced tactical doctrine to emphasize minimizing acoustic signature above almost all other considerations. And it gave anti-submarine forces a weapon that could prosecute attacks with a probability of kill far exceeding anything previously possible. For the Italian submarine service, Fido represented the final fatal blow to an already dying force. The combination of radar, sonar, direction-finding air cover, and improved depth charge tactics had made Italian submarine operations prohibitively costly by late 1942. Fido removed any remaining hope that tactics or skill might overcome technological disadvantage. When a weapon can chase you down using your own noise as a guide, no amount of evasive maneuvering or crew courage makes a difference. You become not a warrior but a target, and targets exist only to be destroyed. The men who served aboard Italian submarines in those final years deserve recognition for their courage, if not for their ultimate effectiveness. They sailed knowing the odds were against them, knowing each patrol might be their last, yet they sailed anyway. When the crash dive alarm sounded and they scrambled to their stations, they did their jobs with the professionalism that comes from hard training and harder experience. That many of them died without ever understanding what killed them adds tragedy to their sacrifice. They fought an enemy armed with weapons they could not even imagine, let alone counter. Their boats became tombs not through any failure of courage or skill, but because technology had moved beyond their capacity to respond. The story of Fido and the Italian submarine fleet is ultimately a story about how warfare evolves, how technological advantage can overcome numerical strength and tactical prowess, and how secrets can be as powerful as firepower. The Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic and the submarine war in the Mediterranean, not just by building more ships and planes, but by thinking differently about the problem. They recognized that detecting a submarine was not enough if you could not reliably kill it once detected. They committed resources to developing a weapon that solved the kill problem in a fundamentally new way. And they maintained the security discipline necessary to prevent their enemies from developing countermeasures before the weapon could achieve decisive effect. Those lessons remain relevant in today's military context, where technological surprise and information dominance can be as important as traditional measures of military power. The nation or alliance that fields a truly revolutionary weapon and protects its secrets long enough to employ it effectively gains an advantage that persists even after the secret becomes known. Adversaries must divert resources to understand the threat, develop countermeasures, and modify their own systems and tactics. This diversion weakens them in other areas, creating opportunities for exploitation. Fido was one such weapon, and its impact on Italian and German submarine operations exemplifies the power of innovation combined with secrecy. As we close this deep dive into one of World War II's most significant yet least known weapons, consider subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. We bring you untold stories from history's greatest conflicts, focusing on the technologies, tactics, and human experiences that shaped outcomes but rarely make it into standard histories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss new content, and leave a comment telling us what aspect of submarine warfare or acoustic torpedo development you'd like us to explore in future videos. History is filled with secrets that took decades to declassify, and we're committed to bringing those secrets to light in ways that honor the people who lived through these extraordinary times. The acoustic torpedo that made Italian submarines helpless was just one of many game-changing innovations that emerged from the crucible of global conflict, and there are many more stories waiting to be told. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.